If any of your friends came to the meeting, saw the SWAT truck outside, got scared and went home, you can have to explain to them that that was part of our presentation. And, you know, I was very fortunate to get a member of the SWAT team. That's what happens when you find former students have important jobs. You guilt them into coming. On this display here, I brought a bunch of books that dealt with sniping. For a long time, there was an interest in sniping among the gun community, okay? But past couple of years, there's just a lot of interest. The movie American Sniper, the book American Sniper. As a matter of fact, in the past 2 weeks, I've been down to Fort Dix twice. Joint Base McGuire, Dix, Lakehurst. And I was able to acquire 3 books on sniping, just came out recently because of what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. World War I, we'll get into the lack of literature. For a long time, there was a lack of literature on sniping, except specialty books for the gun community, all right? And as we go through this historical periods, we're going to start with the Revolution and Morgan's Riflemen. And John Weehawk and Berdan Sharpshooters, and I think the requirement was you had to be able to get, what is it, into a 6-inch bull at 200 yards or something? That was the minimum score. But I'll let Art go into Civil War sniping.
Okay. The term sniper, as most of us know, was not coined until into probably the 20th century. I think we figured out what was it really at Stan, World War I? Or John, where you at? The term sniping in military sense really wasn't used about World War I. Prior to that, men that were expert shots were just always were referred to as a sharpshooter. Now, by the time the Civil War came, weapons had progressed to the point where some of them were the rifled muskets or the rifles were very accurate. And they started to group, and this man, Hiram Berdan, was one of them. Pre-war had started to put together elite groups of people. They're really exhibition shooters, right, John, pretty much? People that were good shots, and they would come out and they would do exhibition shooting. But by the time the Civil War started, there was a need for these people that were expert shots. Now, I'm going to try to do this presentation. I was really going to talk about the southern aspect of it, but I'm going to try to integrate a little bit of the north, and I'm not really that up on Berdan sharpshooters. What I can tell you about them is that they were recruited from outside of the regular army. They were mostly civilians. You had to pass a very stringent test. You actually had to almost audition to get into the ranks of Berdan sharpshooters. They originally were issued the Colt revolving rifle, and they found that to be of poor service quality, was not going to hold up in the field. There was a number of problems with it, chain firing of the chambers. They eventually settled on the double set trigger Sharps rifle, correct? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to refer to you because I'm a little. And just, if anybody knows anything about the Sharps rifle, it was a very, very innovative and was a very advanced weapon for the Civil War, where most soldiers were still using a muzzle-loading weapon with a paper cartridge. The Sharps rifle was a breech-loading weapon. Although it did use a paper cartridge, it was a breech-loading weapon. They also employed the use of what was called a double-set trigger on the Sharps rifles that were issued to Berdan's men. If anybody knows anything about the double-set trigger, the second trigger is a hair trigger, which would be used for, that edge of being a sharpshooter. Now, most weapons in those days in the Civil War were iron sights, or open sights. I call them open sights. Optics had started to come into being used in weapons probably, what, 1850s? Yeah. About 1850s. Now, there were target rifles, civilian target rifles with telescopic sights or optics on them. A very famous weapon is called a Leonard target rifle. Now, these things were very awkward, very large, and very heavy. They were not made to be carried about in the field. They were very fragile. The telescopic sights were usually in turned brass tubes that ran the length of the barrels. One bang with this rifle, hitting a rock or dropping it, and it was done. So they weren't really set up for, the optics on those type guns were not set up for military use out in the field. Static, maybe like in entrenchments or down in something like that, like at Petersburg, maybe, but carrying them about, no. So the government, the Federal Army, never really purchased any guns per se from manufacturers with optics on them. Any of these guns that had optics on them were carried or brought into the service by soldiers. Now, the Federal Army was pretty much standardized. You had to use the weapon that was issued to you or what was available. Not so much in the South. So there were a number of captured later on. If you go to the Gettysburg Museum, there are 2 sharpshooters rifles in the museum there that were carried by Confederate soldiers, and they're not of a military grade. In fact, I believe one of them is a Leonard target rifle. It was the one that was found on top of Devil's Den, supposedly used by the sharpshooter in the sharpshooter's nest, but for all of us now, we all know that that famous photograph and all that is a bunch of hooey. That was a staged photo. The optics that were available, for the most part, like it says, ran the lengths of the barrel. So your sharpshooters mostly, and I'm going to get back into more of what we would call a sharpshooter. And I have to divide this into 2 types because I have to get into the weapons that were used. Now, I'm going to switch now over a little bit more to the Confederate aspect because that's really what my knowledge and my expertise is really on. The South, being on a defensive end, very early started to employ or use sharpshooters. Now, how this worked in the Southern Army was this. Within a regiment or battalion of men, they would take, based on, I wouldn't say hearsay, but recommendations from officers, they would take the best shots out of the different individual companies, and they would group them into one company. Now, they usually use these companies of men as the flanking companies and a regiment or battalion line. Usually, the 2 end companies would have been your sharpshooter companies, not snipers, now, sharpshooters, meaning they were the best shots of the men within that battalion or regiment. They normally tried to arm those men with the better rifle that was available. Now, in the case of in the Southern forces, and I'm pretty sure in the Federal Army, same case, they would issue men that were sharpshooters in the regular Army, not in the, forget about Berdan now. They would issue them usually 2-band rifles. Now, in the U.S., you had the Model 1841, and then you had the Model 1855 rifle. In Southern usage, not only did you have the captured rifles, but they also got a hold of and used a lot of British import rifles. Now, this is the P58 or Model 1858 2-band rifle. It's much shorter than the standard infantry P53 rifle or the Model 1855 rifle or the 61, which would have came up to about almost to my shoulder here. This was a little bit shorter. It made it easier for loading for the soldier. The only drawback to the rifle, to give it its length, was it was usually issued with this very unwieldy, ungainly Saber Bayonet, which could be attached to the side of the gun. I would say for the most part, this was very rarely ever used as a weapon. It weighs a lot. When it's on my hip, if I have it, it literally will pull your belt right down off of you. So I have to say this was not probably a very popular weapon with anybody issued a rifle. But the rifle, and this is the British version, like I said, the P58. It is .577 caliber. It fired a paper cartridge loaded from the muzzle. If you were using British ammunition, the cartridge is made with the ball or the bullet reversed in the end. The Pritchett round that was fired from these rifles that were British manufactured were paper patched. This is what allowed us in this country, where this became like a great universal weapon, because it was .577 and a paper patch bullet. It allowed you to use the standard .58 caliber Manet bullet in it, unpatched. So you could fire the British cartridge, or you could fire the United States standard ball ammunition or mini ball or Manet ball out of this gun. It's a low muzzle velocity. The shorter barrel made it easier to load. I'm not going to go so much into loading. That could be a program in itself and about the cartridges. But in Confederate usage, if you were detailed as a sharpshooter, all it meant was you were a very good shot, above average shot. They grouped you together, and you became exempt from camp duties if you were a sharpshooter. The men that were detailed sharpshooters were normally the men that were put on the picket lines all day long. So during daytime hours, when the sun was up, you were out on the picket line because you were a sharpshooter. You also were also in charge of, in the form of a full retreat, the flanking companies, the sharpshooters, the ones that would have to fall back, and they would have to protect the main body of men as they came off because they were the better shot. So you were going to be a little bit more out in harm's way by being a sharpshooter in the Confederate Army. And like I says, you got this neat little 2-band rifle. I guess that was supposed to be the perk of it. But now, that's a sharpshooter, not to be confused with a sniper. This means you're a good shot. But the South did employ, and it probably was the first time, there was an organized, what we would call, snipers. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is the second weapon here. Once again, this is a British manufactured weapon. This is the pattern 1861 .45 caliber Whitworth target rifle, or military target rifle. It was invented by a man by the name of Joseph Whitworth, who was basically a toolmaker or machinist. He is responsible for anybody who's worked in the machine industry, Whitworth thread. Okay? He was not a gunsmith. He was basically like an engineer or a toolmaker machinist. He invented a very unique pattern rifling. And what he did was, he looked at the concept of the expanding ball into the rifling, and as it was the standard for use for a rifled weapon, and he took a different approach, thinking like as an engineer would think. And in his mind, relying on the gases to expand a soft lead bullet out and into the rifling to grab these grooves, he felt engineering was not really a good idea. He thought he could come up with, build a better mousetrap. And he did. But what he did was it created for the weapon, as John brought up, fouling and loading. It creates a loading problem, but it creates a very accurate weapon. And what he did was this. He designed a rifling and a bullet that fits the rifling, which puts the bullet on its turning axis. The barrel of a Whitworth rifle is hexagonal in shape. It is not a smooth, round, tubular barrel. It is hexagonal in shape, and it has a twist to it. I'm not exactly, I don't know if it's 120, I'm not really sure. I should have done a little bit more research, but it's a twisting, turning, hexagonal bore. The bullet is mechanically fit to the barrel. This bullet, when it leaves the barrel, is put on a mechanical spin. When you load the ball or the bullet into the gun, as you push the bullet down, it takes a while because the bullet has to actually turn and follow the rifling as it goes all the way down. What he created was an extremely deadly accurate weapon for its time. Now, the Whitworth rifles were used by the British Army in the late, I believe they came out in the late 1850s. By the time of the American Civil War, they really were not really well known in this country, but they were known amongst circles of Confederate officers that had saw service in the British Army, one of which was Patrick Cleburne, who had dealings with these weapons while he was in the British service. And these weapons also, being a military target rifle, were also designed, or some of them were designed to have a scope on the side, a telescopic sight. Now, these weapons were extremely expensive. The Confederate government had to pay $1,000 in gold up front. That's today's standards. It'd probably be about $10,000 per rifle. It came with a special mold to produce the bullet and 1,000 rounds of ammunition. That's what they got for $1,000 in gold paid up front. The South got fewer than they think. About 150 of these guns were ever brought into the country. Only maybe about 20 of them had the Davidson 4-power telescopic sight mounted on the left side of the gun. The scope on this gun was not mounted on the top. It was a 14-inch tube that mounted on a dovetail on the side of the gun, which allowed the sharpshooter to either use the iron sight, which was basically calibrated for 1,000 yards, use the iron sights for short range, or you could switch over and you could use the 14-inch scope on the side for long range. The sights on the fascia were platinum plated. These guns were not designed to have a bayonet. They were not that type of a weapon. It took about a minute to load this weapon. But it could be counted on consistently with the 4-power scope for 12, 15, 18, 100-yard hits. And there's even a number of 2,000-yard hits with this gun. Okay? This was a deadly accurate weapon for its time. Low muzzle velocity, but deadly accurate. How did you get this gun? Well, very simple. All those sharpshooter companies, when these guns became available, the sharpshooter companies, they held competitions. The best shots in the sharpshooter companies got the Whitworth rifles. There was probably only a couple of these ever issued out at a time per division during the Civil War. It's not like you're going to run into a guy with one of these during the Civil War. They were very rare, even to see them in the hands. If you saw a guy with one of these, he was known to, he had to be an excellent shot or an expert shot to have it. Of the 150 or so that they think that they've got, they've only found, I think in museum, I don't think there's a dozen of these that have ever been located. They don't know where the rest of them are. When the big surrender came, they weren't turned in. They were not turned in. The soldiers either took them home or destroyed them or whatever. But there's not that many of them that are in museums at all. I mean, it's in the United States here to have a Confederate issue. Now you can tell, there's ways of telling whether the gun was issued to Confederate service or not. You can go by and you can find a period Whitworth rifle, because they made them in England, they made thousands of them. But to find one that was issued out to a Confederate soldier is pretty rare. There has to be a provenance with it, there's markings on the weapon. Confederate used Whitworth rifles are very rare. Now, getting back to the men, I want to say about a sniper. Although the term wasn't used, the men that carried these weapons truly operated as what we would call a sniper today. First of all, once you got this weapon, you were removed from your company. You were no longer a part of an organized company. You now took your commands directly from the commanding officer. You usually worked in pair with a spotter or somebody that went with you. They would be given specific orders, specific targets. These men would go out at sunup and set up, and then they would start. They were not obligated to report to anybody at any given time. The spotter was really there to protect them, and just like we would use today. Usually they can't have a pair of binoculars or spyglass. Their job with these type weapons were to shoot high-ranking officers, artillery horses, which once you kill horses, they can't get the artillery off the field, artillery men. If you were a private, probably didn't have to worry about the guy taking a shot at you with one of these. You didn't want to waste his time. But as you were a high-ranking officer, you had a problem. And probably one of the most famous accounts of an officer being killed by a Whitworth rifle was at the Battle of Spotsylvania, General Sedgwick. Does anybody here know what General Sedgwick's famous last words were at the Battle of Spotsylvania while he was putting up the artillery? Go ahead.
He was saying, sort of like, come on, wasn't he like that?
No, that's Reynolds. That's Reynolds. Somebody else, go ahead.
Couldn't hit an elephant.
Go ahead, Mark, what did he say?
They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance.
Well, there's a famous painting called A Fateful Boast. And the story was General Sedgwick was in charge of, I think he was there on the front lines, I think he was overseeing the placement of artillery, and Confederate nuisance fire was coming in. Now at the range they were at, these were pretty much spent balls, just hitting the ground, hitting the trees. And there was one private that was cowering on the ground. The rounds were coming in. Sedgwick passed him a couple of times and saw this poor young private there. So he tried to lift his soldier's spirits by saying to the young boy, what are you afraid of? What are you worrying about? At that range, they couldn't hit an elephant. And supposedly, at the moment that he said that, a soldier with a Whitworth rifle at 800 yards put a .45 caliber bullet right through General Sedgwick's under his left eye socket. Killed him right where he stood. Now, a lot of controversy about that, but the soldier they've identified by his name. His name was Thomas Burgess, formerly of Company H of the 15th North Carolina Volunteers. And if anybody knows anything about General Sedgwick, he was a very, very well-liked general, north and south. Everybody loved this guy. At 800 yards, this sharpshooter had no idea who he was shooting at. Now there's there's a Bob Powell or Bill Powell was also credited. They said made that shot, and it was another possible soldier, but they pretty much narrowed it down to this Thomas Burgess because there was a report that was made almost immediately to his commanding officer that he had hit a high-ranking officer. They said that, and he lived, I think, into the 1920s. And anybody knows anything about the Confederate Army, in the Federal Army, they had the GAR, and in the South they had the United Confederate Veterans. He would go to these reunions, and as we're going to find as we go later on talking about sharpshooters or snipers, it's not something a lot of these men are proud of doing. They don't boast or brag about it. Even in those days, this was not something you boasted and bragged about. And they used to say that when this Thomas Burgess would go to the reunions, obviously or evidently, somebody would always point out, hey, that's the guy that made the 800-yard hit that killed General Sedgwick, and people would go over up to him and always want to ask him about it. And they always said that he could never be recalled back to that moment. He would turn around and walk away. He never wanted to discuss it. This was 30, 40, almost, sometimes almost 50 years after the war. Never wanted to talk about that. But these Whitworth rifles, like I said, were pretty deadly accurate. And I believe recently somewhere they tested this gun at 1,200 or 1,500 yards against one of the current rifles that's being used by the United States Army for sharpshooting or sniping. I don't think it was the Barrett. It might have been one of the other ones. I can't find the article again, but at 1,500 yards, this 150-year-old gun was just as accurate as the weapon that the Army is using today with a 4-power scope. Now, of course, that's in the hands also of an expert marksman doing it. But on the target, what do you want to call it? The pattern was within the standards it would be for a modern marksman or sharpshooting rifle. So, like I said, the South really did employ what we would call snipers, but they were never called that. They were only called sharpshooters. So, with that, does anybody have any specific questions? There's other little pieces and props that I have that are down there. These guns came with all kinds of tools and things with them because they were specialized. But does anybody have any questions about either the P-58 rifle or the Whitworth rifle, how they operated, how I'm standing here dressed in this ridiculous outfit in the inside here? Anybody? You have? Go ahead.
Well, just one question about technical. When the bullets that were provided with the rifle wore out, did we have the facility when they ran out to make them?
Yes.
Did we have to
With the Whitworth rifle, it came with its mold, and I have the mold for the gun. Each barrel was made longer, and it was cut, and they made a mold from the barrel of the gun, so the bullet actually fit the barrel. Joseph Whitworth later became Sir Joseph Whitworth. He also employed this same design in an artillery piece, the Whitworth cannon, which had like a 2-mile range. And these shells whistled when they came in. I mean, they were very deadly accurate shells. So the concept was used not only in a rifle, but also in an artillery piece.
How did they deal with fouling?
Okay, this is a big problem with the Whitworth rifle. When we're done here, you're more than welcome to come up. Like I said, the bullet's mechanically fit bullet. They had to basically swab this thing out every couple of shots, and/or I also believe, I don't have one, I can't confirm it. I was in contact with the man who wrote the book on this, Mr. John Anderson Morrow, who is the great-grandnephew and great-great-grandson of John Singleton Mosby. He was 101st Airborne and Special Forces. He wrote the book on the Confederate Whitworth sharpshooters. I corresponded with him some years back. He told me that they also had a brass scraper, a piece of metal that was shaped like a bullet, but it was made of brass on a ramrod, that they could actually push down the barrel to cut some of the fouling out. Realize, these guns, you were in no hurry. You shot this gun once a minute, maybe. They weren't line firing these guns like you would even maybe a line sharpshooter or an infantryman. This is one of these shots ringing off every few minutes, so you had plenty of time to run and wipe it down the barrel or whatever. And these were pretty much specialized, like I said, they were specialized gunmen. Fouling was a problem with the Whitworth rifle, but it was never designed to be used in a company line. At $1,000 a piece, you wanted this guy 600-700 yards away, and like I said, to my knowledge, none of these guns were even ever captured by the enemy. There was a bounty on it. That's why the spotter was there. These guns, the artillerymen were so afraid of these weapons that it was not unheard of. When an artillery battery set up, if a guy was in the woods 300, 400, 500 yards away with a Whitworth rifle shooting at artillerymen, they would train an entire artillery battery on a section of woods to kill the man with this gun. Because the man with this gun in less than 30 minutes could probably kill every one of your artillerymen and take every one of your horses out. This guy was dangerous on the field with this gun. John even knows the story about the term ringing a battery. The men, everybody knows about artillerymen, they're unarmed. Artillery short sword, maybe a carbine, maybe a revolver. Artillerymen, for the most part, are unarmed men. A lot of these sharpshooters felt guilty about shooting the artillerymen. So what they would do is they would give these guys a fair chance. They would get out there, like I said, at dawn before the sun came up, set up, and when the sun came up, they would fire 2 shots off. Now, has anybody here ever seen a Civil War artillery piece? Cannon? All right. How wide are the steel tires on the artillery wheel? 3-4 inches wide? Okay. All right. There was a term they would call it ringing a battery. The Whitworth Rifleman would fire 2 shots. He would pick a cannon. He would fire 2 shots. He put the first shot into the right wheel or the left wheel of the artillery piece, and it would ring. And then he'd fire a second shot and put it into the opposite wheel. You're talking at 4, 5, 6, 800 yards away. He's hitting a target that's 4 inches wide. What he's telling you is this: get that cannon out of there, because if you step in front of it, I'm going to kill you. If I can shoot a 4-inch tire on a wheel at my yards, I can hit you very easily. And unfortunately, most artillerymen were not going to move an artillery piece because of that. So these guys were deathly afraid when they were loading the guns. And there was a painting of an artillery battery under the fire of a man with a Whitworth rifle. There's 2 guys left. The rest of the guys are all prostrate, sitting on the ground with various wounds. And there's only 2 men left trying to put a cannon in service. And you see the guy that's doing the ramming, he's looking over his shoulder while he's doing the ramming because he figures the next shot's coming in to get him. So, like I said, that's how deadly accurate these guns were. Any other questions?
Well, I wanted to add, at the Drake House Museum in Plainfield, New Jersey, is a grand history painting called The Death of General Sedgwick, which shows him lying in that artillery battery, and they're cradling his head, but they don't show what the back of his head looks like.
No, I don't think there probably was a lot to cradle, but either way, front or back.
Just to go back to the Union, at Gettysburg, there were 200 advanced sharpshooters in a wooded area. Each man had 90 rounds of ammunition. A full Confederate corps came out of the opposing woods, which was 1,000. They expended all their ammunition in an hour and a half. The full corps pulled back because they thought there was a full corps in the woods.
Right.
They were firing so fast.
Accurately and accurately.
So somewhere out there's probably 15,000 sharp bullets
Yes.
on the ground at Gettysburg out there.
What's the load of that, do you know?
It is huge.
How many grains of powder, and what's the
Well,
weight of the bullet?
It's .45 caliber. It's a bullet's over 1 inch long. It looks like a big suppository.
So it's over 500 grains?
Oh yeah. It's 45. It's probably
Around 525.
525 or so. And the cartridge. See, now to get these kind of ranges, and I'll show you. I couldn't bring all the props up. They did make cartridges, but a lot of the sharpshooters preferred. First of all, to load this gun was difficult. They preferred to carry a powder charge. The charge would be inserted into the barrel. Then you have to put an oil felt wad in down. Then you have to put the bullet in the gun. So all this takes time to load this. So like I said, this is not the type of gun you could do on the battlefield. So there's multiple types of cartridges that they made for this gun. There was even one that was basically a loading tube. That you basically, everything was all set. You placed the tube over the barrel of the gun, and you took the ramrod and you pushed right through the tube. It pushed the powder, the wad, and the ball right down the barrel. Some guys preferred to use the paper cartridge that they made for the gun. Some preferred to use the bullet patched, separate wad, powder charge. It all depends upon the sharpshooter, how he wanted to operate.
That's probably upwards of about 90 grains of powder. Almost.
It was probably more than that to hit yardage of like
Yeah.
1,800 yards or so.
With that projectile being so precisely fit, though, how hard was it to...
It's not. I've shot this gun here. Once a gun is, I mean, you can get a few shots up before you have trouble with it. The biggest problem, and anybody here that's been in the Army that was a sniper, the one thing that they didn't get away from, and I think it's common knowledge, a sniper never should take more than 1 shot from 1 location. That's a given today. It was not a given in those days. These guys would set up in a tree, or they would camouflage themselves in the bushes, and they would stay there and shoot. So eventually they could home in on you. But the difference is, at 5, 6, 7, 800 yards, a puff of smoke from one of these is not the same as 100 or 200 yards. So it still would have been difficult to see where this guy was, unless you had a pair of binoculars and you were scanning the area for him. He was usually out of harm's way. Your chances of being killed as a Whitworth sharpshooter were better, or less than 40% chance, unless they dropped the whole artillery battery on top of you somewhere. Because these guys here were really way out of harm's way. Like I said, there, Bill Powell was, I think it was Bill Powell, or I think that was a fellow, Bob Powell, was a famous Whitworth sharpshooter. This fellow that was reputedly killed Sedgwick, Thomas Burgess was. There's a number of guys, they have wrote accounts about having these guns. If you ever read the book Company H by Sam Watkins, he talks a lot about the soldiers that he came across that had the Whitworth rifles. They were a cut of their own. They were different men all together. They also had sleeve patches that they would wear, because these men, because they were separated from the units, it's not to be picked up as shirkers or deserters. They wore badges on their cuffs that when soldiers saw these, you knew this guy was a sharpshooter. He was allowed to roam, free range roam around. Some of them was a star with a slash. Other one was like a red cross. Another known one that they believe was carried by a man that was a Whitworth rifleman is actually a hexagonal shaped dark blue-black square with a red botany cross in the center. It was donated to a museum in Maryland. They haven't been able, his name was Hugh Wise was his name. They haven't been able to confirm whether he carried a Whitworth rifle or not, but they're leaning that way because why go through all the effort of making the shape of the patch like the bore of a Whitworth rifle? It was hexagonal with a botany cross in the center. So these guys would wear a patch, and then so that they would be allowed to kind of maneuver and go along on their own and not be picked up by the provost or anybody as a deserter. So any other questions?
I guess this is a question for both you and for John. Sometime in the early to mid 18th century, the corning process was developed, which made black powder more consistent. But and by the time of the Revolution, the French powder was far superior to the English powder. That was an advantage for the Continental Army. But was there any difference between the powder a regular infantryman and a sharpshooter would use in either of the wars?
Like with the Whitworth rifle, all I know is the South did import fixed ammunition in from Great Britain. They did use some of the Birmingham-made cartridges, the Pritchett rounds with the paper patches. They also produced Selma Arsenal and Richmond Laboratories. They did produce powder and cartridges there. So I don't know if that was of an inferior. I know the South had a lot of problems with producing a lot of stuff. They had to make niter beds to produce the nitrates to make the powder. I'm quite sure up in the North they didn't have those problems. South was probably, more under a hardship as far as powder is concerned. And ammunition, like I said, the South did import ammunition already made, along with making their own. Although the North did use the P-53 and the P-58 rifles, I'm not actually positive or not whether the Northern armories ever, there was no reason for them to purchase ammunition from England. They used American-made ammunition in the British guns, where the South, it's not uncommon. When you find the Pritchett rounds, or the smooth Pritchett rounds at the relic stops down when you go to the battlefields, I'd have to say 99.9% if it's a Pritchett round, it's a Confederate bullet. I do not believe the federal government produced those. John's saying, they didn't use it. We used our Burton bullet or Manet bullet in the guns. The South were the ones that were using Austrian bullets and Austrian guns, Pritchett rounds and British guns, their version of the mini ball and their rifle. So the South used all different kinds of ammunition, where the North was pretty much, they used the ammunition that was produced in armories here domestically. You had a question.
In other words, the bullet was really hexagonal in shape.
Yes.
Literally.
Yes, and I have them over there. When you put this bullet in the gun, it's not going to drop down the barrel. It sits right there, and you have to push it. And as you push it, you just can't drop it right down. As you push it, the bullet has to actually do this as it goes down the barrel.
How many
so when this thing comes
of an inch in clearance?
A couple of thousandths or two. I mean, it's really tight. When this bullet comes out of here, It's on its spinning axis. It's not relying on the gases to go into a cavity, expand the cavity out, and grab the rifle. Whitworth thought that that was not, he didn't think that was dependable. He wanted to make sure this bullet was going to be on a spinning axis. So he created his own type of a rifle.
Or even if it has a couple thousand square,
Yeah.
with a flat base,
Yeah.
still bump it up.
Yeah, see, the bullets that they use, and I want to wrap it up real quick. The bullets that they use, although commercially for these guns, we buy a solid base Whitworth bullet to shoot this. That is not the bullet that was used by the Confederate forces during the Civil War. There's even a hexagonal shaped bullet with a slight cone cavity in it. That's to take up the windage. The bullet that was used by the Confederate forces was basically a smooth bullet. Even though the barrel is hexagonal, the bullet was a smooth, looked like an elongated Pritchett round with a cone cavity. When the gun was fired, the pressures basically reformed this bullet into the barrel. So the only battlefield pickup of bullets that they've been able to authenticate were used by Confederate sharpshooters are smooth bullets that have been now changed to hexagonal. But they did make a hexagonal solid base and a cone base. But to what's his name that wrote the book, Round Ball, the Rimfire, Dean Thomas states in his book that field recoveries of hexagonal shaped Whitworth bullets are unknown. If you find them, it's probably somebody threw one out there and was hoping to, excite somebody. But I got to move on for the next guy. If anybody, I'm going to be here, so if anybody has any specific questions, please come up and you can look at the implements and things I have there. And if you have any other questions on the poor P-58 got like cast to the side here, I mean, it feels like a second-class citizen here. But that's all I have for you. So, like I said, after the program, you're more than welcome to come up and have a word with me.